The wine glass was still ringing where my sister had tapped it too hard with her spoon when she looked across the table, smiled the smile she saves for cameras, and said it loud enough for the whole private room to hear. "Everyone, this is my sister, Reagan. She picks up other people's garbage for a living. Isn't that sweet? Some of us reach for the stars. Some of us just reach for the bins." The laughter came fast, the way laughter does when people are relieved someone else said the cruel thing first. My mother pressed her napkin to her mouth like she was hiding a smile instead of hiding shame. My father studied his silverware, and I sat there in the blazer I'd bought off a discount rack 4 years ago, hands folded in my lap, saying nothing at all, because I have learned that silence costs less than the truth when the truth isn't ready yet. Then the doors at the back of the room opened, and a man in a charcoal suit walked in with a clipboard and a headset looped around his neck, the way venue staff do when they need to find someone in a hurry. He scanned the room, found my face, and asked the question that would end the evening exactly the way it deserved to end. "Sorry to interrupt, is the owner here? We have a walkthrough issue with the East Wing lighting rig before the Hartwell wedding load-in tomorrow, and they said to find her before 6. The room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when 40 people realize, all at once, that they have misunderstood something important. My sister's smile did not move. It just stopped meaning anything. "The owner," the man said again, a little less certain now, glancing between the faces at the table. "Reagan Voss, this is her table, right?" I set down my fork. "That's me," I said. "My name is Reagan Voss. I am 31 years old, and for most of my life, my family has had a very clear idea of who I am, and none of it was true. I should say up front, I don't tell this story because I want anyone to feel sorry for me. I don't need that, and honestly, by the time you get to the end of it, you'll understand that pity is the last thing I ever needed. I tell it because there's a version of this that happens quietly in a lot of families, where one child gets called the disappointment so often that everyone forgets to ask whether it's true. And I think somebody should say out loud what it costs to carry that, and what it can turn into if you're patient enough, and stubborn enough, and lucky enough to have one person who saw you clearly when no one else would. That person, for me, was my grandmother, Colleen Voss. Everyone else in my family called her Nana, the way you'd refer to a nice photograph on the wall, present, decorative, not particularly relevant to daily life. I called her the only adult who ever asked me what I thought about anything before telling me what to think. Colleen ran a company. Not a big one, not back then. Voss Sanitation and Salvage, a hauling and scrap recycling outfit she'd inherited from her own father in the 70s and kept alive through 3 recessions, a divorce, and a decade where everyone told her a woman had no business running trucks. By the time I was born, it employed 40 people, served 2 counties, and was, as far as my parents were concerned, faintly embarrassing. The kind of thing you mentioned at parties only if you had to, and then quickly pivoted to something else. My mother, Diane, married up from a similar background and spent the rest of her life trying to make sure nobody noticed where she'd started. My father, Peter, worked in commercial insurance and measured his own worth almost entirely by golf club memberships and the zip code on his tax return. And my sister, my younger sister, Marisol, 3 years behind me and infinitely more fluent in the family's real language, which was appearances, understood from an early age exactly what currency mattered in our house, and she spent every year of her childhood accumulating it. Pageant photos, honor roll certificates displayed in the good frames, a closet organized by color. She was, and is, genuinely charming, in the specific way that charm becomes a survival skill when you learn early that being liked is safer than being loved for who you actually are. I was not charming in that way. I was quiet, watchful, more comfortable with a wrench in my hand than a hairbrush, and from about age 7 onward, I was allergic to pretending things were fine when they weren't. My mother used to say I had a hard time with sunny days, which was her way of saying I made her uncomfortable by noticing things. So when I was 8, and my parents were going through a stretch where money was tighter than anyone admitted, and nobody had time to figure out what to do with a kid who asked too many questions during her summer break, It was my grandmother who said, simply, "Send her to me." I don't think my parents thought much of it. I think they thought of it as free babysitting from a woman who had nothing better to do than putter around a scrapyard. What actually happened is that Colleen Voss spent the next 10 years of my life teaching me, without ever once making it feel like a lesson. That work has dignity, that systems can be understood if you're patient with them, and that the people who look past you in a room are very often the people who will one day need something explained to them by exactly the person they looked past. I learned to read a balance sheet before I learned to parallel park. I learned the difference between a Roth conversion and a straight tax write-off sitting on an overturned bucket in a scrap warehouse while Colleen sorted invoices with a cigarette she wasn't supposed to be smoking hanging out of the corner of her mouth. I learned that a fleet of trucks is really just a very large, very slow-moving logistics puzzle, and that the person who understands the puzzle owns the leverage, whether or not anyone else in the room respects the job. "They're going to underestimate you your whole life, Bug," she told me once, when I was maybe 13, sitting in the cab of a truck while she filled out a route sheet. "Your sister, your mother, probably your father too, though he'd never admit it. They're going to think quiet means small. Let them. It's the cheapest advantage you'll ever get, and it's free, and all you have to do to keep it is stop needing them to see you." I didn't understand it then. I understood it a great deal better 20 years later, standing in that private dining room with a lighting technician waiting on my answer. By the time I was in college, the family narrative about me had calcified into something nobody bothered to question anymore. Reagan is the odd one. Reagan likes machines more than people. Reagan works with her hands, which is fine, I suppose, though we don't quite understand it. At Thanksgiving, my mother would ask Marisol detailed questions about her marketing internship at a boutique PR firm, nodding along with real interest, and then turn to me and ask, with the specific brightness people use when they're performing engagement they don't feel, "And how's a small pause," like she was searching for a word that wouldn't embarrass either of us. The truck thing. The truck thing. That was Voss Sanitation and Salvage, a business with 40 employees and a payroll I helped audit every summer since I was 16, reduced to 2 words that made it sound like a hobby I'd pick up and put down, like model trains. I went to college on a partial scholarship, and the rest paid for by hauling routes I ran on weekends and school breaks, which my parents found more embarrassing than helpful. My mother once asked me, with real distress in her voice, to please not mention to her book club friends that I'd spent spring break doing manual labor, as though I'd been arrested rather than employed. I studied environmental engineering, because by then Colleen and I had started talking, quietly, about where an old-fashioned hauling company could go if someone modernized it. Sorting technology, materials recovery, municipal contracts for recycling infrastructure that most competitors were too slow or too undercapitalized to chase. Nobody in my family asked what my degree was for. They assumed it was a nice, harmless thing I was doing before I figured out what I actually wanted to do with my life, the way you'd describe a gap year. Marisol, meanwhile, was becoming exactly what our parents had always wanted, engaged to the right kind of people, visible at the right kind of events, dadding, by her mid-20s, a rotating cast of young men our mother described using their father's job titles before their first names. "That's Dale, the Hartwell boy. His father owns half the commercial real estate in the district." I want to be clear that none of this is a knock on Marisol as a person. She was, and largely still is. Kind to me in the specific, absent-minded way you're kind to a piece of furniture you've always had around. It's not that she was cruel by design. It's that she never had to think about me hard enough to be either kind or cruel on purpose. I existed in her peripheral vision, a fact of the household, filed under older sister, practical, doesn't get it. Colleen died when I was 26. It was fast, a stroke, on a Tuesday morning, in the office trailer at the yard she'd worked in for 51 years. I got the call from her longtime operations manager, Holly's Bryce, a man who'd worked for her since before I was born, and who I would later come to trust more than almost anyone in the industry. I drove 2 hours with my hands shaking on the wheel the whole way, and I got there 20 minutes too late, and the last thing I remember clearly from that day is sitting in her office afterward, alone, looking at the framed photo on her desk. Not of my mother, not of Marisol, not even really a family photo at all. It was a photo of the two of us, me at maybe 11 years old, filthy, grinning, holding up a wrench like a trophy, standing next to her first truck. The will reading was 3 weeks later. I want to tell you honestly that I did not expect much. I assumed, the way you assume things about people who have spent their whole life being underestimated, that whatever she'd left me would be sentimental rather than substantial. A keepsake, some tools, maybe a modest sum. I assumed the business itself, the real asset, would go to my parents, or be split evenly, or sold. Because that's simply what happens to businesses when the person who built them dies and nobody thinks to ask the quiet granddaughter what she's capable of. I was wrong about almost all of it, and the shape of exactly how wrong is a story I'll get to. But I want you to sit, for a moment, in what it felt like to walk into that lawyer's office not knowing, surrounded by a family that had already decided, without saying it out loud, that whatever came next would obviously belong mostly to them. If you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the one everyone assumed had less going on than they actually did, drop a comment below and let me know. I read every single one, and this story only gets more interesting from here. The lawyer's office was small and beige and smelled like old carpet and coffee that had been reheated too many times. My parents sat together on one side of the conference table, my mother's hand resting on my father's arm in a way that looked supportive and was, I'd come to learn, mostly proprietary. Marisol sat beside them, 23 at the time, dressed like she was attending a slightly more casual version of a funeral, which I suppose, in fairness, she was. I sat alone on the other side. The attorney, a careful, unhurried man named Arthur Denby, who had handled Colleen's affairs for over 2 decades, went through the preliminary items first. Some jewelry to a cousin in Ohio, a modest bequest to the church Colleen had attended twice a year out of habit more than faith, some equipment and a small cash, some split between my mother and my aunt. Then he got to Voss Sanitation and Salvage. The entirety of Voss Sanitation and Salvage, LLC, including all real property, fleet assets, contracts, and associated holding entities, is to be transferred in full to Reagan Elaine Voss. I remember the specific silence that followed. Not shock exactly, more like the sound of several people recalculating, very quickly, a math problem they thought they'd already solved. My mother recovered first. That must be a mistake. Reagan doesn't even, she's not, Mom would have discussed something like that with the family. She discussed it with me, Denby said, mild as ever. Repeatedly over a period of years. This isn't a recent decision. The transition planning began roughly 8 years ago. 8 years. I did the math without meaning to. 8 years earlier, I'd been 20. I'd been sitting in that scrapyard office learning depreciation schedules on weekends while my mother told her friends I was figuring things out. My father asked the obvious, blunt question, "What's it worth?" Denby glanced at me before answering, a small, deliberate courtesy that I noticed and appreciated. With the municipal contracts secured over the last several years and the recovery facility acquisition finalized last spring, current valuation is a little north of $41 million. I want to be honest and tell you I don't fully remember the next few minutes. I remember Marisol's face doing something complicated. Not jealousy exactly, not yet, more like confusion, like she was trying to reconcile the sister she'd spent her whole life filing under harmless with a number that large. I remember my mother saying, faintly, "That can't be right," several times, as though repetition might change the figure. I remember my father not saying anything at all, which from him was its own kind of answer. What I remember most clearly is Denby sliding a second, sealed envelope across the table to me and saying, "She also left you this. She asked that you read it alone." I put it in my bag. I didn't open it in that room. I wasn't going to give any of them the show of watching my face while I read the last thing my grandmother ever wrote to me. I'll tell you what it said, just not yet. What I'll tell you now is what happened in the parking lot 40 minutes later, because it tells you everything you need to know about how the next 5 years of my family were going to go. My mother caught up to me by my truck, the same truck, more or less, that I'd been driving since college, dented on the passenger door, smelling faintly of diesel no matter how many times I cleaned it. She stood there for a second, arms crossed, and said, "You're not actually going to run it, are you? You have a degree. You could sell it, invest the money properly, do something respectable with your life." I remember looking at her and understanding, really understanding for the first time, that my mother's disappointment in me had never actually been about the job. It was about what the job made her feel she had to explain to other people. It had never once, in 31 years, been about whether I was happy or good at what I did or building something real. "I am doing something respectable with my life," I told her. "I'm doing what she trusted me to do." She didn't have a response to that. She got in her car and drove away, and I stood in that parking lot for a long time before I trusted myself to drive. Here is the part of the story that I think people misunderstand most, when they hear the setup and assume it's simple. Poor sister, secretly rich, waiting for her moment to unveil the truth like a movie reveal. It wasn't like that. There was no plan to surprise anyone. There was, for 5 years, simply a business to run, and a family that had already decided who I was, and very little appetite on either side to revisit the question. I threw myself into the company the way Colleen would have wanted, not flashily, not for show. I spent the first 18 months mostly in coveralls, on-site at facilities, learning operations I'd only studied on paper, earning the trust of a workforce that had every reason to be skeptical of a 26-year-old owner who looked, by her own admission, like she belonged more on a loading dock than in a boardroom. I kept Holly's Bryce as operations lead and leaned on him hard in those early years. I restructured the recycling side of the business around materials recovery technology most of our regional competitors hadn't caught up to yet. I bid, successfully, on 2 county-wide municipal contracts that tripled our fleet within 3 years. I acquired a small commercial event services company almost by accident. A client who couldn't pay an outstanding invoice offered equity instead. And I said yes mostly because Colleen always told me to take ownership stakes when they were offered, even in businesses that seemed unrelated, because optionality compounds. That event services acquisition would, admittedly, turn out to matter a great deal more than I expected at the time. I did not, in any of this, correct my family's understanding of what I did for a living. Partly because I genuinely didn't care what they thought. Colleen had given me that gift, the real gift, which wasn't the money. It was the permission to stop needing their approval to feel solid in myself. And partly, if I'm honest, because there was something almost peaceful about being underestimated. Nobody asked me for anything. Nobody wanted a piece of me, or a loan, or an introduction, or a favor, because as far as they knew, I had nothing to offer beyond a strong back and a willingness to smell like a job site. I went to Thanksgiving in jeans. I let my mother introduce me. When she introduced me at all, as my daughter who does the sanitation thing. I let Marisol, over the years, refer to me at parties as her sister who drives a garbage truck, which was not even technically accurate. I hadn't personally driven a collection route in 4 years, but which I never bothered to correct, because correcting it would have meant explaining myself to people who had never once asked a real question about my life. There were, however, small moments in those 5 years that told me the ground was shifting more than my family realized, even if none of us said so out loud. There was the summer my father's insurance firm lost a mid-size commercial client, a logistics company, to a competitor, and he came home irritated for a week, and I found out later, from an old contact, that the client he'd lost had switched providers because a smaller, more aggressive brokerage had underbid him on a contract tied to waste management liability coverage for a facility that happened to be one of mine. He never knew that. I never told him. There was the wedding of one of Marisol's college friends, an enormous affair at a converted vineyard estate that Marisol talked about for months afterward, describing the flowers and the lighting design in reverent detail, not knowing that the event production company she was so impressed by was the one I'd acquired 2 years earlier, and that I had personally signed off on the final vendor contract for that exact venue. There was the moment, about 4 years in, when Holly sat me down and told me, with real seriousness, "You know your grandmother would be out of her mind proud of you, right? You know that." And I remember not being able to answer him for a second, because it was the first time in a long while someone had said something like that to me without needing anything in return. By the time Marisol got engaged to Dale Hartwell, the same Hartwell family my mother had been name-dropping since Marisol was in college, whose father, it turned out, owned the commercial property portfolio that included the very event venue booked for the engagement dinner. The gap between what my family believed about me and what was actually true had grown into something almost geological. Layers of assumption, compacted over years, that none of us had bothered to disturb. I didn't plan for that gap to close the night of the engagement dinner. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. I didn't walk in that evening expecting a reveal. I walked in expecting exactly what I'd learned to expect at every family event for the last decade: to sit quietly near the end of the table, answer polite, condescending questions about the truck thing, and go home. I had no idea that the venue Dale's family had booked, the same converted industrial loft space that had become the venue for the city's wealthier engagements over the last 2 years, was, as of 4 months earlier, a property my company had taken a controlling ownership stake in as part of a larger events and logistics acquisition I'd been quietly finalizing since spring. I had no idea that the lighting and production crew working the event that night reported, several layers up their chain, to me. I had no idea, sitting down at that table in my 4-year-old blazer, that within the hour, a stage manager with a clipboard was going to walk into that private room looking for the owner, and that every single person at that table was about to learn, in real time, exactly how wrong they'd been. But I'm getting ahead of the story, because before we get back to that dining room, there's something you need to understand about the second envelope. The one Colleen left me, the one I read alone, 3 weeks after her funeral, sitting in my truck in an empty parking lot with the engine off and the windows fogging up. That letter is where the real story starts. Before we get to what was in that letter, and what happened next in that dining room, tell me in the comments. Do you think Reagan should have told her family the truth years earlier, or was she right to let them find out on their own? I want to hear both sides. I sat in that parking lot for a long time before I opened it. The lot belonged to a diner Colleen used to take me to on Saturday mornings when I was small. The kind of place with a laminated menu and coffee that was always slightly too strong. And I think I drove there without quite deciding to, the way you sometimes end up exactly where you need to be without meaning to plan it. The envelope had my name on it in her handwriting, not Reagan, but Bug, the name only she ever used, the one she'd given me at 8 years old because I used to follow her around the yard so closely, so quietly, that she said I reminded her of something small and industrious that refused to be swatted away. I'll share it with you close to how she wrote it, because I think her words matter more than my summary of them. She told me she was proud of me before she was anything else, not proud of the balance sheet, not proud of the contracts, but proud of the version of me that showed up at 7 in the morning on a Saturday, at 11 years old, without being asked twice. She told me she'd watched the rest of the family for years, watched the way they measured worth, and she wanted me to understand that she hadn't left me the company because I was the only one who could run it. She'd left it to me because I was the only one who had ever asked to understand it, really understand it, not for what it could buy, but for how it worked. And then she told me something I didn't fully understand until later. She wrote that about 8 years earlier, the same 8 years Denby had mentioned in that office, she'd had a difficult conversation with your mother, one she'd never planned to tell me the details of unless it became necessary. She said if I ever needed to understand the full shape of why the transition had been planned so carefully, so far in advance, with so many legal safeguards built in, I should ask Arthur Denby to show me the file marked with my grandfather's old initials. RTV. A file, she said, that she'd hoped I would never need to open. I didn't open it then. I put the letter away, and I ran the company the way she'd taught me, and for 5 years I didn't ask Denby about any file. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was that I was busy. Part of it was that I trusted her completely, and if she hadn't wanted me to know something urgently, I didn't feel a rush to find out. And part of it, if I'm truly honest, was a small, quiet fear that whatever was in that file would make it impossible for me to sit across a Thanksgiving table from my mother and pretend things were merely awkward between us rather than something worse. That fear turned out to be justified, but it would take the engagement dinner and everything that came apart afterward to bring me back to Denby's office to finally ask to see it. So let's go back to that room. I think you deserve the whole scene now, not just the hook. The venue was called the Iron Loft, an old textile warehouse converted into exposed brick and steel event space, the kind of place that photographs beautifully and costs more per hour than most people's monthly rent. Dale Hartwell's parents had booked the private dining room on the second floor for 40 guests, an intimate gathering ahead of the larger wedding still a year out. String lights, a jazz trio in the corner, servers in black aprons moving through courses that arrived faster than anyone could finish talking about the last one. I'd arrived a few minutes late, on purpose, the way I usually did, so I could slide into my seat near the end of the table without much ceremony. My mother had placed me between my aunt's husband, a pleasant, forgettable man who talked mostly about his fantasy football league, and an empty chair reserved for a cousin who never showed. It was, I understood without anyone saying it, exactly where the family had decided I belonged in the seating chart of their lives, near the edge, easy to overlook, close enough to be present, far enough not to be embarrassing. Marisol was radiant that night, and I mean that sincerely. She loved Dale, as far as I could tell, in the specific, easy way people love each other when nothing has ever forced them to be tested. She stood to give a toast about halfway through the meal, thanking her parents, thanking Dale's parents, and then, working her way down some mental list of family members to acknowledge, she got to me. I want to be fair to her here, because in the years since, she's told me she doesn't fully remember deciding to say what she said, that it came out of a kind of nervous, performing energy, the need to have something funny to say about everyone at the table, and I believe her mostly. That doesn't make it not hurt. It just makes it a smaller kind of cruelty than the deliberate kind. The kind that happens because you've simply never had to think about someone carefully enough to know where the bruises are. And this is my sister, Reagan, she said, raising her glass toward me with a smile, the whole room's attention swinging my way. Everyone, this is my sister, Reagan. She picks up other people's garbage for a living. Isn't that sweet? Some of us reach for the stars. Some of us just reach for the bins. You already know what happened next. The laughter, my mother's napkin, my father's silverware, and then the doors opening and a man in a charcoal suit with a clipboard and a headset scanning the room for the owner. What I didn't tell you yet is what happened after I said, "That's me." For a moment, nobody moved. The stage manager, I'd find out later her name was Priya Akaffer, one of our newer production leads, looked between me and the rest of the table, clearly sensing she'd walked into something she hadn't been briefed on, and said, a little more carefully, "Ms. Voss, sorry, we can circle back if this isn't a good time." "It's fine," I said, and stood up, wiping my mouth with the napkin I'd been holding in my lap the entire dinner. "What's going on with the rig?" The East Wing dimmer banks throwing faults ahead of tomorrow's load-in. Facilities wants a decision on whether we pull in the backup unit tonight or eat the overtime tomorrow morning. "Pull it in tonight," I said. "I don't want the Hartwell wedding crew walking into a lighting problem at 6. Tell facilities I authorize the after-hours call-out. It's on me." "Got it, thank you." She gave a small, apologetic nod to the table, the reflexive courtesy of someone realizing, mid-sentence, that she'd just detonated something private and left the way she came. I sat back down. 40 faces were looking at me. My sister's glass was still raised, halfway between the toast and the table, forgotten in her hand. It was my father who spoke first, in the flat, careful voice he used when he was recalculating something important in real time. "Reagan, what did she mean, the owner?" "I own the Iron Loft," I said. "Well, my company does. We acquired the events division about 4 months ago. I don't usually get involved in day-to-day operations, but I signed off on tomorrow's contract personally because it's a big wedding and I wanted to make sure it went smoothly." I paused, and I want to tell you honestly that I hadn't planned what I said next. It simply arrived, calm and unhurried, the way things do when you've been holding them for a long time. It's actually the same company that runs the sanitation and materials recovery contracts for both counties. The truck thing, I said, glancing at Marisol, not unkindly, just plainly. It's a little bigger than a truck thing now. It's about $41 million bigger, give or take, since the last valuation. I will remember the silence that followed for the rest of my life. Not because it was satisfying, though I won't pretend some small, human part of me wasn't glad, finally, to say a true thing out loud in that room after years of letting a false one sit unchallenged. But because of what it revealed about how little anyone at that table had actually known about the person who'd been sitting quietly near the end of it for years. Dale's father, a broad, genial man who'd made his own fortune in commercial real estate, was the first to really react, and not with embarrassment on my behalf, but with the specific delight of someone recognizing a peer he hadn't known was in the room. "Voss," he said slowly. "Voss Sanitation. You're the one who took the county recovery contract away from Meridian last year. My partner's been trying to figure out how a company that size outbid a firm 4 times its scale for 18 months. He laughed genuinely and raised his glass toward me. "Well, I owe your operations team a phone call. That was a hell of a bid." My mother's face, throughout all of this, had gone through several distinct stages. Confusion, disbelief, something that looked almost like fear, and then, unmistakably, calculation. I watched her do the arithmetic. I watched her realize that the daughter she'd spent 31 years quietly apologizing for was, in fact, the most successful person at that table, by a significant margin, and I watched her decide, in real time, how to begin repositioning herself around that fact. "Well," she said, with a bright, brittle laugh reaching to pat my hand, "you could have told us, sweetheart. We would have loved to celebrate this properly. This is wonderful, truly wonderful." I looked at her for a long moment. "I did tell you," I said quietly. "I told you when Nana died. I told you what the will said. You asked me if I was really going to run it, or if I'd rather sell it and do something respectable." I didn't say it to embarrass her, not really, though I understand if it landed that way, in front of 40 people. I said it because it was, simply, true, and I was tired, after so many years, of being the only one in the family who remembered things accurately. Marisol set her glass down. She hadn't said anything since the stage manager left, and when she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd heard it in years. "I didn't know," she said. "Reagan, I swear I didn't know any of that. It was just a joke. It's always just a joke." "I know," I said, and I meant it mostly. "That's kind of the problem. We're getting into the real turn of the story now. What came out about the will, and about a conversation my mother had 8 years ago that changed everything. If you've made it this far, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because the next part is the one that surprised even me when I found out. I went to see Arthur Denby 2 weeks after the engagement dinner. I hadn't planned to wait that long, but the days after that night were strange and heavy in ways I hadn't expected. My mother called 4 times. My father sent one stilted, formal text that read only * proud of you. We should talk. And Marisol showed up at my office unannounced on a Wednesday, sat in my lobby for 40 minutes without an appointment, and when I finally came out, simply said, "I want to understand." Actually understand, not the version we've been telling ourselves. I let her in. That's a part of the story I'll come back to. But it was Denby's office, that gray Tuesday, where I finally asked about the file with my grandfather's initials. He didn't look surprised that I'd come. "I wondered how long it would take," he said, and pulled a folder from a locked cabinet behind his desk, thick, worn at the edges, the kind of file that had clearly been added to over years rather than assembled all at once. What was in it, in short? 8 years earlier, when I was 20 and deep in my accounting coursework, spending weekends learning the business, my mother had gone to a different attorney, not Denby, someone she'd found on her own, and attempted to have a power of attorney drawn up over Colleen's affairs. Her stated reasoning, on the intake paperwork Denby had later obtained copies of, was that Colleen was increasingly erratic and vulnerable to poor financial decisions. Language that, when I read it, made my hands go cold, because I had spent every weekend of that entire year with my grandmother, and there had been nothing erratic about her. She'd been sharper than anyone I knew. The attempt hadn't gone far. The attorney my mother approached, to his credit, insisted on an independent capacity evaluation before proceeding, standard practice for a document that's significant, and the evaluation conducted, ironically, without Colleen ever fully understanding why a doctor was suddenly asking her detailed cognitive questions during what she'd been told was a routine check-in, came back showing exactly what anyone who actually knew her could have predicted. Full capacity. No cognitive concerns whatsoever. The attorney quietly closed the file and, per his professional obligations, notified Colleen directly that the request had been made and by whom, since the evaluation had been performed on her without a clear, honest explanation of its purpose. Colleen never told me. She told Denby, and she told him something else, too, a plan. If anyone in the family ever attempted anything like that again, or if she died before I was old enough or established enough to protect the business on my own, she wanted every asset structured so airtight, so far ahead of time, so cleanly outside anyone's reach to contest, that there would be no ambiguity left for anyone to exploit. That's what those 8 years of transition planning Denby mentioned in the first meeting actually were. Not simply succession planning. A woman quietly, patiently building a fortress around the one person in her family she trusted, because someone else in that family had shown her, plainly, what they were capable of when they thought no one was watching closely enough to catch it. I sat in Denby's office with that file open in front of me for a long time. I didn't cry, though I want to be honest and say some part of me wanted to. Mostly I felt something colder and clearer than sadness, the particular, settling calm of finally understanding a shape you'd only ever felt the edges of. "Does she know I have this now?" I asked. "Your mother? No," Denby said. "Colleen never wanted it used as a weapon. She said if you ever needed to see it, it would be because you needed to understand why she'd protected you so carefully, not because she wanted you to go to war with your mother over it." I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. I didn't confront my mother with the file the way I could have. I want to be clear about that, because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters most, more than the dinner, more than the number Denby read out in that first meeting. I called her about a week later and asked her to meet me, not at her house, not at a restaurant, but at the scrapyard, the original one, the one Colleen had run for 51 years, and that I still kept operating exactly as it had always been, even with 3 larger facilities now under the company's umbrella. My mother had been there maybe 4 times in her entire adult life. She showed up in shoes wrong for gravel and stood near her car for a moment before I waved her toward the office trailer, the same one where I'd gotten the call about Colleen's stroke 5 years earlier. I didn't show her the file. I asked her instead a single question. "Did you ever try to have Nana declared incompetent?" I watched her face carefully. She didn't deny it, I'll give her that much credit, even now. She sat down slowly in one of the trailer's old vinyl chairs, and after a long silence she said, "I thought she was making bad decisions. Letting you spend all that time out here instead of somewhere that would actually help you. I thought," she stopped, started again. "I thought I was protecting the family." "You were trying to protect the family from her decisions," I said. "Not from anything actually wrong with her mind. You just didn't like the decision she was making." She didn't answer that directly. Instead, she said something that honestly surprised me with how true it was. "I didn't know how to be proud of something I didn't understand, Reagan. Your father's world, Marisol's world, I understood those. Country clubs, weddings, the right schools. This," she gestured, vaguely, at the yard outside the window, the stacked scrap, the idling trucks. "I never understood what you loved about it, so I decided it wasn't worth understanding." That was easier than admitting I didn't know how to talk to my own daughter. I'm not going to tell you that conversation fixed everything. It didn't. My mother and I are not, as of this telling, close in the effortless way she and Marisol are close. But something shifted that day in the trailer, a kind of honesty neither of us had been willing to risk before, because honesty in my family had always felt like a weapon rather than a bridge. I told her about the file eventually, that same afternoon. I watched her absorb it. I told her I wasn't going to do anything with it. No lawsuits, no public accounting, nothing that would turn our family into the kind of story people whisper about at other people's dinner parties. I just wanted her to know that I knew. "Why tell me at all, then?" she asked, "if you're not going to use it?" "Because you don't get to keep pretending you didn't do it," I said. "That's not punishment. That's just the truth, sitting in the room with both of us, finally, instead of hiding somewhere neither of us has to look at it." It's been 2 years since that engagement dinner. Marisol and Dale got married the following spring, at a different venue, actually, a smaller one, because Marisol asked, gently, whether it would be strange for me to have my own company staff her wedding, and I told her honestly that it might be, and she listened, which was new for both of us. We're closer now than we've ever been, Marisol and I, not because of some single dramatic reconciliation scene, but because of 100 small, ordinary conversations since, the kind we never used to have time for when the family narrative about who I was left no room for anyone to ask a real question. She comes out to the yard sometimes now, on weekends, the way I used to go to Colleen's. Last spring, she asked me to teach her how to read the fleet maintenance reports, not because she needs to, but because she said she wanted to finally understand the thing she'd spent her whole life making jokes about instead of asking about. I think that's its own kind of apology, maybe the only kind that actually means something in a family like mine, not the words, but the willingness, finally, to sit down and learn. My father and I talk more than we used to, mostly about business, which is its own language for him, the only one he's ever been fully fluent in, and I've stopped needing him to speak any other one. My mother and I are still working on it. Some days that feels like enough. Some days it doesn't. I've made peace with the fact that it may never look like the relationship I used to wish we had, and that the relationship we're actually building slower, more honest, considerably less comfortable, might be worth more in the long run than the easier one we never really had to begin with. The company is close to $60 million in valuation now. We opened a 4th materials recovery facility last winter, and I still go out to the original yard most Saturday mornings, out of habit more than necessity, because it's where I feel most like myself, and because it's where I can still, if I sit quietly enough near the old office trailer, remember exactly what it felt like to be 11 years old, filthy, grinning, holding up a wrench like a trophy, being seen completely, patiently, correctly. By the one person who never once needed me to be anything other than exactly who I already was. I think that's the real inheritance, if I'm honest. Not the $41 million, not the fleet, or the contracts, or the recovery facilities. It's the specific, stubborn confidence of having been truly seen by someone once early enough that it didn't matter how long everyone else took to catch up. They caught up eventually. Some of them anyway. But I want you to remember, if you take nothing else from this story, you don't need the room to see you before you're allowed to know exactly who you are. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let them keep guessing, right up until the moment the truth walks in wearing a headset and asks, quite plainly, for the owner. Thank you for listening. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear which part hit hardest in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming every week.